All right, let's start. It's midwinter exactly, so it's good to see this hardy band of lost souls who's got nothing else better to do.
Yeah.
Turn up the pub for a cold beer. Congratulations. Yeah. Now today I'm going to speak about, I think, the most important and influential revolutionary movement that Australia has ever seen. And I'm talking about post-colonisation. I'm going to speak about the industrial workers of the world, which I believe have been basically written out of not just the historical record, but the labour record. And there's a good reason for that. Now, I'm not going to dwell on personalities, although I will raise some personalities. I'll actually talk about the organisation, how it began, how it evolved in Australia, their policies, how they worked, how they organised. Now, if anybody's interested in following this up, there are two excellent books that have been written. One is by Verity Bergman, Burgmann, published by Cambridge University Press in 1995, called Revolutionary Industrial Unionism. And the other one was actually published in 1969, which looks more at the more, how should I put it, the more interesting radical elements of the movement at the end of its days, by Ian Turner, which was published in 1969, which is called Sydney's Burning. Okay? So who are the industrial workers of the world? How do they begin? Well, there is a phrase that a Dago is cheaper than a safety device in a mine. And this was the attitude the Federation of Western Miners in the United States of America was faced with. That miners were dying at a rapid rate in the mining industry in the United States of America at the beginning of the 20th century, because the employers were not willing to institute safety devices. For them, it was cheaper to replace a worker who was killed than to actually invest in safety devices. So this is what was seen in the USA at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the Western Federation of Miners, which is the west coast of the United States, was quite a radical outfit, militant outfit. It needed to be militant. The employers used private detectives like Pinkerton's agencies. Activists were lynched and killed. So they were quite a militant organisation. Right? Now, in 1905, two socialist groups, the Socialist Labour Party and the Socialist Party of America, decided to try to join forces with the militant workers from the Western Federation of Miners. And after an 11-day conference, 11 days, in Chicago, they formed the Industrial Workers of the World, and its preamble was based on political action and direct action. Action at the point of production and political action through parliamentary politics. That was the compromise agreement in 1905. Now, the Socialist Labour Party makes most sectarian socialist groups look like amateurs. And it was basically using the new organisation as a mechanism by which to recruit members to the party. It wasn't that particularly interested in what was happening. And in 1908, there was a second Congress where the direct actionists, the more militant trade unionists, broke away from the socialist faction. And so the IWW split into two. There was the Chicago branch, which changed the preamble to no parliamentary action, direct action, and there was the De Leon branch, which was Leon was the leader of the Socialist Labor Party, and they continued to conduct activities in Detroit, but they were just a minor, minuscule part of the industrial workers of the world. Now, in Australia, things were happening which were not happening in the rest of the world. We had federation in 1901. We had the Conciliation and Arbitration Act enacted in 1904, which set a minimum wage with the Sunshine Harvester decision in 1905. We had a rampant Labor Party, which was the first Labor Party which was elected to government in the early 1900s, both at the state level, especially New South Wales, and the federal level. So, and we saw an explosion in trade union membership. It tripled between 1901 and 1910, and the number of unions jumped up to about 150. So people expected change. There was that expectation in the air that there will be major change for working people in terms of wages and conditions and many other things. At the same time, there was a very active socialist movement in the east coast of Australia and West Australia during that period. So what happened is the Socialist Labor Party of Australia set up industrial workers of the world clubs around Australia. These were just, to a significant degree, these were debating clubs. And they were a mechanism by which they were trying to recruit people into the Socialist Labor Party. Now, there are various other socialist groups, like Victorian Socialists, and was obviously falling out between the various socialist factions. But they were using the industrial workers of the world clubs as a mechanism to recruit members but not conduct workplace struggle. And Monty Miller is a well-known syndicalist, was elected the president of the Melbourne branch in 1908. Now, by 1911, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction amongst militant workers regarding three issues. One was the fact that Labor didn't deliver. Electing Labor governments was not delivering the goods to workers. There was a Labor government nationally, there was a Labor government at the state level in New South Wales. Secondly, the Conciliation and Arbitration Act was enacted in such a way as to put most of the balls in the hands of the employer. So there were minimal gains coming out of the Conciliation and Arbitration Act. At the same time, the trade union movement, which was based on trade, not syndicalism, I'll talk about it. The trade union movement itself was ossified and wasn't delivering results to people. So in 1911, 11 workers in Adelaide asked for a charter from the Chicago Industrial Workers of the World to set up a branch, they used to call them locals, in Adelaide. So at the same time, people had become disillusioned with the socialist parties because all they were doing basically was trying to recruit people into their particular parties, and most of them were based on vanguard principles, not mass action principles. So you had these four issues. Now, the industrial workers of the world were different to every other organisation in the workplace at that particular point in time. The Australian Trade Union Movement at the Trade Union Congress in 1903 had made the decision that racial purity was integral to the Australian labour movement, and in 1908 they made the decision that the White Australia policy was the way forward for the trade union movement. So in the Australian Trade Union Movement at that particular time, if you're a woman, you couldn't join. If you're coloured, you couldn't join. So it was a closed shop. Okay. So when the industrial workers of the world turned up in Australia, they were different for a variety of reasons. They were different because they were an inclusive organisation. Unlike most trade unions all trade unions at that particular point in time, they accepted women as members and they accepted people of all races as members. There was one provision. You can only be a member of the industrial workers of the world if you're a wage earner. You had to be a wage earner to actually be a member. The way they organised was on the basis of locals, and what the locals had was independence in terms of their activities. They had to follow the charter, and the charter had a number of important principles which was incorporated in the industrial work in the locals. One was there were no paid officials. They didn't want what they described as strap hangers in the organisation. No paid officials. All decisions were made by the membership. But they did have a majority rule mechanism, and if the majority decided on a particular course of action, the rest of the organisation was mandated to follow that particular course of action. They were also against what they call bourgeois respectability. They were anti-militarist, they were internationalists, they were anti-nationalists. These were all in their charters. Now, at this particular point in time, capitalism was developing into a more corporatised, centralised method of production. So they believed that the only way to deal with this is to incorporate everybody who was a wage earner into that organisation, irrespective, as I said, colour, creed, sex. Now, it hadn't, since 1886, apart from the Melbourne Anarchist Club, no other organisation had a anti-racial platform among working organisations, including most of the socialist countries in this country. So what they did is they provided a mechanism for people who were exploited in the workplace to be involved in an organisation, because their policy was, if the boss doesn't care who he or she exploits, why should we care about a person's colour or sex or religion? The other thing which was central to the industrial workers of the world ideology was anti-parliamentarism. A lot of people believe that the IWW were apolitical. The IWW were not apolitical. They were totally political, but they were against being involved in parliamentary elections, because they'd seen what had happened with the election of Labor government with a significant majority. There was no change in the workplace. So they weren't apolitical, as people tend to say. They were apolitical, like nuts. They were anti-parliamentarian. They also believed that the trade union movement was obsolete, and you needed an organisation like the syndicalist organisations in Europe. Because, you see, syndicalism is based on the principle that people associate because of common threat. That's what you associate. So in a workplace, every worker in that workplace belongs to a particular organisation, but there's no underlying political philosophy or ideology in that organisation. That's a syndicalist organisation, more like a European union, which are workplace-based, not trade-based, so they incorporate everybody. So you had the syndicalists, So they had a syndicalist method of organisation by incorporating everybody into what they described as the one big union. If you're a syndicalist, you work towards a general strike, and in the general strike, the theory is leads to revolutionary change. If you're a member of the industrial workers of the world, the revolution occurred now, and it occurred through direct action at the point of production. It didn't occur through parliamentary action. It didn't occur by union action, but workers taking action at the point of production. That was their key philosophy. That's the difference. That's what they were on about. And their philosophy was that you would get peace and plenty when everybody would join this one big union, and you would move with minimal amount of violence from a period of revolutionary change, which came through direct action, which came through promoting reforms, where more and more workers joined these locals, and these locals federated, and they became the new. It's a philosophy that didn't work, but that was their underlying philosophy. Bring everybody in, militancy, take over the workplace, and you don't need to go through this, this so-called this process of struggle, revolutionary struggle and bloodshed. So they believe once you've got the one big union, you move from the situation of being a wage slave to a situation where you control your workplace, you share the resources, so you get to a period of peace and prosperity. The other thing about the industrial workers of the world is they had their own culture. They created a culture which was based on anti-nationalism, anti-militarism, and a culture which was based on simplicity in terms of explaining what you wanted and how you wanted to work, and a culture based on pushing for reforms at the workplace. They had their own language. For example, a bonehead. A bonehead is a word which the IWW created, which is somebody who's a boss lover, somebody who's a racist, somebody who's a nationalist. That's a bonehead. Then you've got black-coated vultures. They're ministers of religion. Pie in the sky. So they had their own terminology. And their total rejection of socialist policies was encapsulated in their greetings. They didn't call each other comrade. When you met another member of the IWW and you shook hands, you said fellow worker. Hello, fellow worker, irrespective of race or sex or creed. So their anti-racist rhetoric was more than rhetoric. On the 31st of January 1914 came out the first issue of Direct Action, which was their monthly newspaper. And it was printed by the Sydney local, which was the biggest local. And in the 3.5 years that Direct Action was printed, and by mid-1950 it was a weekly. You could buy it for a penny. There were 44 separate articles against racism. So it was a continuing thread in their ideology. Also, the Australian IWW understood the plight of Aboriginal Australians. You can see literature that talks about their extermination and the fact that they had been forced off their lands and they were being exterminated. Now, they didn't organise among Aboriginal workers, but they understood that role. On the 1st of July 1915, you'll find this very funny. You've got to remember there are a lot of Chinese workers in Australia at the beginning of the 20th century. Some, from the gold rush, those that had come in, right? Now, there was an obituary for a man called Fu Shi. Who was Fu Shi? Fu Shi was a prominent Chinese anarchist from Guangdong province, which is, the Cantonese-speaking part of China. And you've got to remember that most immigrants who came to Australia from China came from Canton, and they didn't speak Mandarin, they speak Cantonese. And he had translated IWW literature into Cantonese, which then they distributed amongst Chinese workers across the country. So it wasn't just words. They put their anti-racist stance into practice. For example, there was a general strike in the Northern Territory, I think about 1910, 1911. There was 750 European workers, 2,500 coloured workers, wage slaves. The coloured workers didn't scab on the strikers, but even after the strike, they weren't allowed to join the trade union. That's how ingrained, you got to understand, racism was. But people tell you all organisations all radical organisations at the time were racist. They're not. The IWW highlights the importance of incorporating all wage slaves. That's what they call people, wage slaves, into the organisation. 44 articles in about 30 issues of direct action. Talking about anti-racism is significant. Not just talking, but incorporating people. Now, I'll give you an example. Now, sex, right? Women, gays. Some of the more prominent individuals, and I'll talk about individuals here, and then I'll go back to general ideas, who are involved in the industrial workers of the world, were openly gay. One of the most important activists was a bloke called Charlie Reeve, who I'll speak about later on. Openly gay. He was one of the prominent speakers of the IWW. Now, the IWW had this concept of what they described as the rebel girl. Right? Now, the rebel girl was the militant female wage earner. And there are many names I can raise regarding militant women workers in the Australian industrial workers of the world. You've got people like Lesbia Harford. People know her as a poet. They know her as a solicitor. She was born in the 1880s. She died in, I think, 1927 at the age of 36. She was born with a congenital heart disease. She was openly bisexual. She graduated as a solicitor, and even today, a female solicitors association or lawyers association has a yearly lecture, in honour of her, Hartford, Lesbia Hartford. She was so interested in the industrial workers of the world that she refused to practice as a solicitor and took up wage work in a clothing factory in order to be able to join the industrial workers of the world. Now, there were women, but they were fewer in numbers. I think a big error that was made by the industrial workers of the world, the Sydney branch in 1916, when they were coming under increasing pressure, there was a motion debated. The motion was debated to allow wives of wage slaves to become members of the IWW. It was defeated by the membership. You had to be a wage slave to be a member. You couldn't be a wife. You couldn't be self-employed. You couldn't be this. You couldn't be that. So in many regards, they excluded a lot of people. Now, the other thing about the IWW is they're mainly composed of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. The skilled workers joined the trade unions. The semi-skilled and unskilled joined the industrial workers of the world because they were welcomed into the industrial workers of the world. At the same time, you had this floating population across the British Empire because there were no passports before World War I, and you had free travel. within the British Empire. You could go to India. You could work in South Africa. You could go to Canada. You could even go to the United States. You'd come to Australia. Minimal questions asked, because at this particular point in time, the colonial powers, those that had usurped First Nations people from the land, were busy building infrastructure, and they required labour. So you could be a militant in one part of the world, get jailed, be a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and then move to another part of the British Empire and continue your behaviour, your militant behaviour. So there's all these. See, to me, every revolutionary movement flourishes for two reasons. One, because of the engagement of the membership that are interested in pushing those ideas, and two, because of particular conditions. So there were these conditions where the itinerant single male worker, which formed the backbone, about 70% of the industrial workers of the world in Australia, it was a moving population. They could grab issues, or there'd be posted issues of the direct action, and they could distribute it in cans, in the shearing sheds in Western Queensland, in the mines in the Northern Territory. It was a little bit like a modern day virtual world. But they had minimal ties. They didn't have children, they didn't have partners in the majority of cases. So they had minimal ties, but they had their labour to sell, and they believed in the idea of getting reforms. They knew that you got reforms by direct action at the point of production. Now, a lot of people think that the IWW are nothing more than a bunch of naive saboteurs. If you look at the literature, the IWW was not interested in individual acts of sabotage. And they weren't interested, and they made it very clear, in any sabotage which put people's life, endangered people's lives. And when they talked about sabotage, in the majority of cases, they were talking about collective action. Things like go slows, things like a poor day's work for a poor day's pay, things like people losing tools. So there's collective general action to actually sabotage the productive process without taking major risks. So by the beginning of 1914, I think there were about 7 or 8 locals established in Australia that were based on the Chicago IWW model of direct action and no parliamentary action. There was the Adelaide local was the first local established. Then there was a local established at Sydney, and I'll talk about the Sydney local because that was the more active local. There was a local established at Broken Hill, a local established at Port Pirie, so you can see all the mining centres, Boulder City, and then locals established at Melbourne, Brisbane, and they even had a Russian-speaking local in Cairns. I mean, this followed their philosophy on inclusivity, right? And a Russian-speaking local in Cairns. They had some other smaller locals, but these were mainly transient, because a lot of these workers, itinerant male workers, were transient. Now, what happened on the 4th of August, 1914? At this particular time, you may have had 500 members of the IWW. There are a minor irritation in a limited number of workplaces, like Broken Hill, Port Pirie, where these isolated mining areas. But on the 4th of August, war broke out, 1914. And the Prime Minister at that particular point in time said, "We will support the British Empire to the last man and last shilling." On the 10th of August, 6 days after war is declared, the IWW puts out a special issue of Direct Action with the headline, "War What For?" Now remember, I said these people were anti-militarists, anti-nationalists. And they believed that this war that was going to explode, nobody had any idea how deadly it was going to be, how many fatalities, was basically a war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. It was essentially a trade war between sovereign nation states, most of the world like monarchies. So could you imagine 6 days after war is declared, direct action, anti-war, anti-militarist. Now, the declaration of war on the 4th of August 1914 was a way that many men were able to escape the drudgery of everyday existence. And Australia, which had a population of about 500 million at that particular point in time, not 500 million, 5 million, my apologies, I thought it was Indonesia, 5 million at that point in time, a whole 5 million, 420,000 men volunteered to fight in the war to end all wars, because you've got this hysteria. If you look at pictures of the 4th of August, people were on the streets, they were celebrating, they thought it'd all be over in 4 weeks. Men thought this is a way to get away from the wife and the kids. This is a way to get a wage every week, get a roof over your head. This is a way to see the world. You know, people didn't leave their little towns. They didn't have the resources to go overseas in the majority of cases. It was a great adventure. So this was 1914. By about 1915, the casualty lists are coming into Australia. Remember, that's 1 in, say, there'd be about 1.5 million to 2 million adult men. That's 1 in 4 volunteered to fight this bullshit. Right? Now, the industrial workers of the world were able to use the fact that war was not only damaging to individuals and families because of the deaths, and let's not forget that of the 420,000 men that volunteered, 62,000 died on the European killing fields. 8,000 in one day in France. 62,000. There were those that came back, another 60,000 died of war wounds, mustard gas, festering war wounds, psychological issues, suicide, within 10 years of returning. Okay? So you're getting an increasing desire. You're getting a lack of volunteers. When people who were left behind realised what was going on, they're not going to go and volunteer. You know, I remember I looked at some literature about a meeting at Dandenong Town Hall. This is about 1916, halfway during the war, calling for volunteers. Not one volunteer. There was an anti-war meeting the next week. Town hall was packed. All right. So the IWW was the spearhead of the anti-conscription movement. Now, people talk about the anti-conscription movement. Now, what happened when Billy Hughes, who was a Labor Prime Minister, went to England? He was admonished because we weren't sending enough troops to Europe to be killed in the European killing fields. And he was promoting a policy of introducing conscription into Australia. His dilemma was that the Labor Party he was leading of, only about 1/3 of the Labor Party representatives supported conscription. So he decided they would hold a plebiscite, not a referendum, but a plebiscite, like the plebiscite which was held regarding gay marriage, sex marriage. A plebiscite. And he thought it was going to be a lay-down misère. What he forgot was that although the IWW was against parliamentary politics, they weren't against plebiscites. They were not against voting. What they were against was voting for parliamentarians who then didn't deliver goods. So they became involved in the anti-conscription struggle. At the same time, you had feminist groups like the Women's Peace Army, which came on board in 1915. Although they had differences with the feminist movement, and their differences revolved around the issue of all men being the enemy, which was the same debate we have today. They aligned themselves with the Women's Peace Army, and lo and behold, they aligned themselves with the Roman Catholic Church under Archbishop Manos because of the Easter Rebellion in 1916 in Ireland. Now, they didn't support Irish nationalism, they supported a workers' rebellion in Ireland. So you had all these disparate groups had come together to oppose the plebiscite, which was going to be held on the 28th of October 1916. At the same time, the IWW had grown in strength, especially the Sydney local. There were about 2,000 members of the due-paying members of the IWW around Australia. About 1,500 were part of the Sydney local. The Sydney local was a strong local because there were a number of very fascinating individuals that had arrived in Sydney almost simultaneously, trying to escape jail sentences because of strikes and militant activities they've been involved in South Africa, in Canada, in New Zealand, which had a general strike, and these were brilliant orators, people like Tom Barker, the editor of Direct Action. See, the IWW had a sense of humour, and that was another strong thing there. Strength of irony and humour. The editor of Direct Action on the newspaper was a block of wood, right? So when the police would come, they'd want to speak to you, they take him to the block of wood. A block, right? That's the editor. Although the real editor was Tom Barker, and he was very good. He was going to be jailed for being involved in the general strike in New Zealand, and then came to, there's no passports, came to Australia, bang, bang. Then there were people like Tom Mann. Now, he's an interesting character. He came across from, I think it was England, could have been Scotland. He arrived in Victoria at the age of 18 or 19 in 1899, joined the Victorian soldiers that were sent to fight the Boer War. This was before Federation, and each state sent troops to fight the Boer War, to fight the Boers in South Africa. He then joined the police, the South African police, but was fired when he refused to shoot a Zulu boy. That was part of their thing, was to shoot people and keep the blacks under control. He then got involved in strike activities and then escaped to Australia. Now, he was a brilliant orator. Then there was Grant, forgotten his first name, another brilliant orator. And you had people like Annie Westbrook, brilliant orator, because many of the women in the IWW were involved in its day-to-day activities. And they had things like rotating chairs for their meetings. They had, as I said, no paid employees except for the editor of Direct Action. So there were all these people that kind of arrived at the same time, and you had this anti-conscription movement which was growing by the day. Now, Billy Hughes and the Labor Party had no doubt that the conscription referendum would pass on the 28th of October. But just to make sure things went ahead the way they wanted to, the War Precautions Act was introduced. And that meant that anybody who did anything to inhibit the war effort could be sentenced to 6 months in jail. And that meant singing songs, anti-war songs, at a protest meeting. And you've got to remember, as I said before, the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, had a sense of humour. They had a hymn book, like the Salvation Army hymn book. They had the IWW hymn book. And those of you who think that Solidarity Forever is some type of Marxist biblical thing, it's not. It is a song which was created by the IWW. Songs regarding Joe Hill, created by the IWW. The song Bump Me Into Parliament was actually created by Bill Casey in Melbourne, a Melbourne Wobbly, a member of the IWW, and that's to the Yankee Doodle. So they had their own songbook in competition with the Salvation Army. So you'd have the Salvation Army on one corner, you'd have the IWW militants in the other corner. So they did have a sense of humour. They weren't these dour, correct line revolutionary types. They were militant workers, basically. And so that's why they were difficult to control. They weren't part of the Labor movement or the Labor Party. They weren't part of the trade union movement. They were something which was outside these, and they actually poo-hooed bourgeois, which you call respectability. For example, the IWW women were famous for disrupting the national anthem. They would carry on like pork chops or chooks in a barn. They would disrupt the national anthem. Could you imagine what would happen today if you disrupted the national anthem? They would openly disrupt it and defy the national anthem because they were anti-nationalist. Right. So, in order to ensure the referendum the plebiscite is successful, you need to create fear in the community. And nothing creates fear more than saying that the IWW are German agents. They are arsonists. They are treasonable. They're all criminals and felons. They're rapists. They're murderers. And if you look at the literature, especially the papers in Sydney at that particular point in time, as the referendum gets closer and closer, there are these huge articles about the enemy in our midst. Right? There are secret police. There are spies. There are informers. So on the 23rd of September 1916, a month before the plebiscite, the Sydney local is raided. And unfortunately for the IWW, they find a membership book. There were 1,091 members who paid their dues, 21 of which were women. So what the authorities did, went to their workplaces and got them fired. And in a period where there is minimal social security benefits, and none if you're an activist, especially for those with children and dependents, it was a big, big issue. At the same time, on that same night, they arrested 12 prominent members of the IWW, most of their more well-known orators, who were drawing crowds of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people to open-air meetings across Sydney, in Melbourne, in Adelaide, promoting the anti-conscription struggle and increasing their membership at the same time by promoting direct action. Because with war, what was happening is prices were increasing because people were profiteering from the war. And the IWW slogan was, they'll fight to the last man and the last shilling, as long as it's not their shilling or their family. You know, that was the thing. You know, that was the thing. And that's what was happening, because as the body count increased, nobody wanted to volunteer. Okay? So we've had these 12 who were arrested. They were charged with treason felony, which is a capital charge. At the same time, things are hotting up in the New South Wales countryside. 3 members of the Tottenham branch of the IWW, which was the Kennedy brothers and Franz Fritz, shot dead a police officer. Personal grudge, nothing to do with the IWW. Franz Fritz and Roland Kennedy were found to be guilty. They were hung at the end of 1916 at Goulburn Jail. But again, they tried to link what happened in Tottenham with what the IWW is all about. At the same time, a few other members of the IWW and other sort of people had been counterfeiting £5 notes. They were caught. So you've got this hysteria. You've got German agents, police murderers, arsonists, treason felony. They've been arrested just before the plebiscite. You would think that would be enough for the Australian people to support conscription. You've got to remember that although the Women's Peace Army and the Catholic Church were against conscription for their own reasons, the IWW was not just against conscription, they were against war, they were against militarism. They had a much more radical position. Guess what happens on the plebiscite on the 28th of August 1916? It fails. One of the great things that's happened in this country's history, which nobody talks about. We have hundreds of monuments to people who have sacrificed on the European killing fields, and hardly any monuments to the failed plebiscite, which saved another 60,000 young men from being, killed on the European killing fields. We're talking about 8,000 in one day. So, trials are held. The 12, after the plebiscite was failed, the charges were changed. They were changed from treason felony, which is very hard to prove, to conspiracy to commit arson, seditious conspiracy, and conspiracy to free Tom Barker, the editor of Direct Action, from jail, because he was there at that particular point in time. He was in jail because of a cartoon which had appeared in Direct Action, because we refused to pay a fine. The 12 were found guilty and sentenced between 5 to 15 years jail, 6 to 15 years jail, 5 to 10 years jail, and 1 to 5 years jail. At the same time, what Billy Hughes did, the Prime Minister of Australia, is he crossed the floor. 1/3 of the Labor Party followed him and joined the National Party, and they formed a government of national unity, leaving the ALP rump behind as a minority. Then came what I think was a brilliant ploy, and we can do this, and we'll talk about this later on, about how it correlates with what's happening in Australia today. They gave the Governor General, under the Illegal Association Act, the power to ban any organisation at any time the government asked the Governor General to ban an organisation. So that meant there was no parliamentary debate. It was just a matter of the Prime Minister asking the Governor General to ban an organisation. The Industrial Workers of the World was banned, and any local which continued to exist, their members would be jailed for 6 months automatically. So there was debate amongst the various IWW locals. The Melbourne local, which was the most conservative, disbanded. They preferred to disband than actually be jailed for 6 months. The Broken Hill local made a majority decision, that single men with no dependents would sacrifice themselves and go to jail for 6 months. The IWW in West Australia, including Monty Miller, many of them went to jail for 6 months. 103 of the members of the IWW received that 6 months jail. So by June 1920, the IWW as an organisation had ceased to exist. But the struggle in Australia against the war had not stopped. Because what had actually happened is there was a general strike, mainly in New South Wales and Victoria in 1917, because of war profiteering, and which brought the country to a halt. To a large degree, the tactics that were used were tactics which were promoted by the industrial workers of the world. Now, what happened after that, it gets complex. And you've got to remember, the trial was a farce. If you go to Sydney's Burning, Ian Turner's book, 1969 book, you've got detectives giving evidence that he saw another detective with what they described as fire dope in the bag of one of the 12, right? Then you've got the fact that the main informant, Mr. Scully, was given a £2,000 reward. Now that's 15 years' wages. That's an extraordinary amount in 1916. And there were informers, there were police spies, there were lies. The jury was convinced, as I said, they were all jailed. Then comes Free the 12 movement, all right, which went on for a while. And it's interesting. Two members of the New South Wales Labor Party, I think it was Mr. Brookfield, who's well known in radical circles, and Mr. Minahan were expelled from the party because they were considered to be sympathetic to the IWW. When the next election was held, the national government was defeated by the Labor Party, but it had to rely on the two Labor independents who were re-elected, Brookfield and Minahan, for a majority. Now, the National Party called, because of the pressure which was being applied, the National Party called the Royal Commission, which said all the sentences were normal. So the new Labor Party, under pressure, and because these two men held the balance of power, organised for Justice Ewing from Tasmania to act as an independent arbitrator in New South Wales. And he found that 6 of the men had been jailed for no reason. 5 had already served their sentence for seditious conspiracy, which anybody can be charged with seditious conspiracy, so why? And 2, one was the counterfeiter King, and the other one was the Charlie Reeve I spoke about. Well, they would have to fulfil their sentences. So the whole thing, and there always is justice in life. Mr. Scully, the chief informer, was kicked to death in the Darlinghurst police station on the 21st of August 1921 because they were afraid that he was going to spill the beans and they were going to be charged. And that was the end of that. The tragedy was that none of those, even the 6 of the 12 that were guilty of nothing, were found guilty of nothing, were offered any compensation. So what happened to the IWW? Now, Mr. Ted Ryan was the Premier of Queensland. He was sympathetic to the IWW, not in terms of their actions, but he said he wasn't going to jail anybody for their ideas. And a lot of the IWW activists that were still around went to New South Wales. Went to Queensland, to escape prosecution. But the organisation itself was finished by mid-June. Now, between 1920 and 1940, there were various manifestations of the industrial workers of the world which put up their heads. Some were very successful, especially among the unemployed in Adelaide. The Melbourne local was reformed. The Brisbane local was reformed. But again, things had changed. Australia had changed. The conditions had changed. The Labor Party was much stronger. The trade unions had pulled back. And we saw the emergence of the Communist Party of Australia in 1921. So what happened to the prominent activists in the IWW? Well, Tom Barker, the editor, was deported to Chile. They just used to pick him up, put him on a boat, deport them. Then Chile deported him to Argentina. Then from Argentina, he joined the workers' movement there. There was a very strong workers' movement. He eventually ended up in Russia during Lenin's period. He married in Russia. He saw the early disintegration of the Soviet Empire, the Soviet experiment, saw the increase in authoritarianism, and then went with his wife to live in England. He joined the Labor Party. He was elected a councillor for Camden, and he died in 1917, becoming the mayor of Camden in, I think, 59-60. So that's Tom Barker. What happened? I've told you Lesbia Harford died at the age of 36 because of a congenital heart disease. Annie Westbrook, who was Maggie Miller's daughter, she continued to be an activist and a militant until in her 80s. Tom Mann, the South African policeman who came in as great orator. He contracted a disease in Long Bay Jail when he was jailed. He was one of the 12 conspirators, and he died in 1934. Our good friend Charlie Reeve, openly gay, he set up a. He wasn't allowed to stay in Sydney when he was discharged from prison in October 1921 because of the Illegal Association Act. He went to Adelaide where he reformed the IWW, went to Melbourne where he reformed the IWW, was a very strong militant activist. He ended his days in Broadway where he opened up a bookshop and died in 1932 in the arms of one of his lovers. Right, who else is there I want to talk about? I think his name Donald Grant. He was their most famous speaker. I could get his, I may have got his first name wrong. He was their most famous speaker. He was a red-headed Scottishman. Thick brogue. He could entertain thousands of people, project his voice. He was a brilliant speaker. So when he was discharged from jail, he joined the Communist Party. The Communist Party expelled him because of the anti-authoritarian and pro-syndicalist tendencies. So then he joined the ALP. He became an alderman. He then, in 1942, he got Senate pre-selection, became a Labor Party senator, and lost pre-selection in 1959 and died at Double Bay in 1970. Then you had another couple, Jock and May Wilson. They were an interesting couple. They were prominent in the IWW. When they were deported back, they went back to England. They joined the Communist Party. They were made organisers in the Welsh branch of the Communist Party. They described the Communist Party like the British Communist Party as vomit. Came back to Australia and were involved in the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. So these people didn't lose their radical tendencies. They may have changed, but they were still engaged in activities. Then you had Mr. King. He was one of the counterfeiters. After he was released from jail, he joined the Communist Party of Australia, the newly formed Communist Party. He was expelled for syndicalist tendencies. He rejoined the Communist Party. They sent him to Russia at the height of the Stalin period in 1930, where he became an exemplary worker. Right? He came back in 1936, told them all fuckwits, and went to retire someplace in Queensland. So the brief time they spent, these brief 3 years they spent, had a significant impact, not just on them individually, but in terms of the creation of the Australian Communist Party, which tried to recruit as many of these militants as possible, but more importantly, on the influence they had among trade unionists in terms of using, meals of action on the job site at the point of production. Now, what are the parallels with Australia? I know you're getting bored, but what are the parallels in Australia 2025? What happened then can never happen again. Because the Australian ruling classes, the Australian Parliament, has understood there is no point creating martyrs and filling jails with martyrs. Today, as you know, it is illegal to strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement, period, and you've got to jump through so many hoops. Anybody is involved, whether they're unionist or not, in activities in a workplace can be jailed, can be fined $10,000 for each individual day they're on a wildcat strike. And this happened in West Australia about 20 years ago. So 2 organisers. Could you imagine that? They know. They don't want people in prison. But they know, especially if you've got dependents and you've got financial responsibilities, even if you've got no dependent and you've got a little bit of money set aside, a $10,000 a day fine, which the courts will impose, is a great method of controlling any workplace militancy. Now, people like Doug will tell you about all the occupations that used to occur in the 70s and 80s and 60s, the BLF, all these occupations. If you are involved in a workplace occupation in Australia today, you can be jailed for 25 years. Now, remember I spoke about the act by which they closed down the industrial workers of the world, the Anti-Insurrection Act. Today, you don't need to tell the Governor-General to ban an organisation. Under legislation which was passed after 9/11, the Minister for Home Affairs, that used to be the Attorney-General, can ban any organisation because he or she believes they may pose a threat to Commonwealth property or security. And the key is property. So even vandalism of property. Now, if an organisation is proscribed, there is no right of appeal legally. And if it is proscribed and you continue to be a member of that organisation, you can be jailed for 25 years. Or if you raise money to assist people in jail, you can be jailed for 25 years. And those of you who don't think this happens, just see what happened in England in the last few days, where Palestinian activists have been arrested because they've been deemed to be a member of a proscribed group, and they face 12 years imprisonment. So you've got all these mechanisms that have been put in place. And the dilemma is in Australia, and I've spoken about this before, and I'll finish in a minute, is that in Australia we have no constitutional protections in terms of the individual. Because when Federation occurred in 1901, there had been a 10-year debate, and those elements in the Federation debate regarding creating the new constitution voted down the idea of having individual human rights in the Australian Constitution. So under the Australian Constitution, the government can pass legislation about, if it's got a majority in both houses of Parliament, about almost anything it likes. And that legislation is now in law. And there's no constitution, there is no High Court challenge to that legislation. Because you only have 4 rights in Australia. A limited right to freedom of religion, a right for trial by jury for a major crime, a right for just compensation if your property is acquired by the state, and the right that we all love, I'm sure you all love this, is the right that I have not to be discriminated against because I'm a Victorian, because of the state in which I live. And remember, it's a federation of states, so this is an important right to bring people together. So, we are at a particularly difficult time in this country's history in terms of organisation. Another thing I'd just like to remember is how superannuation is now being used as the ball and chain on most workers' necks. So it is a very grim, and unless there's some type of mass, well, maybe not an uprising, but mass resistance, the chances of change, the chance to do anything like they did is impossible. But the interesting thing is, they told us you can't trust the Labor Party, you can't trust the parliamentary system, you can't trust the trade unions, and that you have to form organisations where the membership controls those organisations and they're willing to use direct action at the point of production to gain reforms to improve people's lives. So all I can say is, as we face the 50th anniversary of the dismissal of the Whitlam Labor government, when you think of those that are old enough who are involved in disputes at that particular point in time, what we could do and what today people can do, chalk and cheese. Chalk and cheese. No.
And they're talking about making any criticism of any act of the Israeli government an act of anti-Semitism.
No, you got it wrong. It won't go past Parliament.
Of course not.
No, but they're talking about any
the criticism.
No. You can criticise the Israeli state, but you can't criticise that the Israeli state can't exist. They're going to try to make anti-Semitism equal Zionism.
Yeah.
Well, but they're going to do it in legislation, and they can. If they had a majority in both houses of Parliament, they could.
Hang on, anti-Semitism equals Zionism? Did you just say?
Well, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
You didn't say anti, you said Zionism.
Well,
Right.
Okay,
gotcha.
Okay, so
what they've done is
that makes sense now.
what they've done is they want to define what anti-Semitism is, and anti-Semitism is denying the state of Israel the right to exist. So it's much more subtle.
Terra nullius.
Yeah.
Deny the state. But again, the only thing that's going to change this is mass action. And as we saw in the Russian Revolution, it didn't start because of the Bolsheviks. It started because ordinary people had enough of the war, enough of the murder, and things can change very rapidly in a society. Very rapidly. They can change for the better. They can change for the worse. But here we are talking about fighting the Chinese.
Oh, look over there. Look, no, nothing here. Just look over there.
You know how much it's going to cost to intern 1 million Chinese citizens in this country? Because they're war criminals. They did that for the Italians in World War II. They interned 35,000.
And I've got an interesting thing that happened to me recently was that I got some money together to donate to Palestine, and I was told very clearly, be careful, because who you donate it to, it could constitute
Terrorist
a terrorist
terrorist organisation.
Yeah. And so, as a result of that, there's one organisation it means that you're not necessarily supporting on the ground, but I've written down the organisation that you can support. It's a bit like giving you money to the UN or something.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was shocking that you can't even support.
The legislation is there and people have been pulled up. I know because I've seen people. I know people have been pulled up. I mean, you may donate, for example, about a year ago, there was going to be an arts display to assist the Syrian autonomous government in northeast Syria.
Yeah.
They've been deemed to be a terrorist organisation, and that support activity could not go on. Yes, same thing, prescribed. So the government can prescribe any organisation without going through Parliament.
Yeah.
So you don't. This is the beauty. You don't have to go through Parliament. So we could be prescribed. I'd like to be prescribed all the rest. I mean, we could be prescribed for holding a terrorist meeting here, talking about the industrial works. No, we haven't got a hoodie. No, but I know it's ridiculous. But the Wednesday Action Group, when this new legislation came out 20 years ago, 21 years ago, we actually set up we were citizens for treason. And we go to the government, Commonwealth government, to actually arrest us under the new legislation. Obviously, we weren't worth the effort. But there are things you can do, but there's always consequences when you, as an individual or a small group, take on the state. There are always consequences because you will lose everything, especially if you've got assets. So See, the IWW didn't own anything. They owned a 70-year-old press, which was putting out 9,000 direct actions a week in its heyday. They had no money. Their money came from their dues from their members, and they used to sell direct action for a penny an issue. So there's nothing you could do to them except jail them. You couldn't take away their property because they had no property. They used to lease halls, rent halls for their meetings. You couldn't. They had nothing, and these were itinerant workers mainly who had nothing. No, you keep your heads up. That's the whole point. You keep your heads up because the state overreacts. And when the state overreacts, that's when you generate possible support in the community. As long as you don't do stupid things. And that's the dilemma. They rely on us doing stupid things. And that's what they feed on. And that's how they create hysteria and hatred towards, people do stupid things. But if you don't do stupid things and you're elderly, there's a heck of a lot of things you can do. No. We've got less to lose. We've got more options.
As in, we haven't got kids that we're trying to keep alive and school and so on.
And there's not many brownie points battling you to the ground. With your little glasses and beanie, you look like a little gnome. Not many points. People love gnomes.
Although I got assaulted by the police at a policewoman at a demonstration, and there I am, this little old lady standing there, trying to stop them chopping a tree down, and shoved aside. And I was so shocked by that. Thinking,
she's a woman.
but I wasn't doing anything.
Yes, you were.
And
You're obstructing the law.
No, but they hadn't asked me to move.
Why would they?
Well,
Look what's happening around the country today. Somebody brandishes a machete from 20 metres away and you're blown away. Nobody cares. Look at the bloke here, down in Footscray, the homeless man.
Yeah.
A few months ago. He's blown away.
Yeah, he's stuck.
There's protests here in Fitzroy. Well, Footscray, just down the road.
Down in Paisley Street.
Yeah. All you got to do
Albert
is
Street.
have anything in your hands, and you'll be legally blown away.
Yeah.
So the key is you put your hands on your head. I'm being serious. And they get away with it every time.
Yeah.
Every time.
They investigate themselves and untoward.
But it's not their fault. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to, if that happens, they're trying to shoot.
It runs counter to murder and manslaughter law and use of excessive force.
You got to
resulting in manslaughter. Yeah.
You got to prove it. You got to prove it. You got to prove it in a court of law. You've got everything. See, most people who are shot are basically they've either got an issue, or they're angry. They're not people with resources. Their families have no resources. They may have had a mental issue, and so there is no momentum. Say if one of their mates was shot, it'd be a different story. There'd be momentum.
What about the old lady that was tasered and...
Yeah, well, he got a 5-year suspended sentence.
Kuna.
Yeah.
Suspended. So be careful. I've heard about people like you.
Yeah.
Is it a steak knife or something that you...
She had a steak knife, but she was
on a walking frame.
and she was 91.
Yeah.
I mean...
That's just unforgivable.
I also think that a lot of police officers these days don't, and I know this may sound counterintuitive, they don't actually have the beef or the muscle to actually deal with violent offenders, and the easiest way to deal with the situation is to pull out your gun and shoot. You know, and I mean, I remember the number of times that I'd be hugged by the law in the good old days.
Well, most of these things are criminal issues, they're mental health issues. These people need help, not a badge and a gun. They need support services, and they're cutting them all back and they're demolishing the high-rise estates where. And there's going to be more of this because people are being turfed out onto the streets.
Police hate doing this type of work. They hate doing social work.
Yeah,
Because what we're doing is we're using the police force,
Vegan what?
not to deal with criminal activity,
yeah.
but we're using the police force as a method of social control
I know.
to control problems that we don't deal with.
Exactly, because